I'm Cathy Stewart, and this is the Politics for the People book club, brought to you by Independent Voting and the People. Let me extend a special hello to our first-time book club participants. I want to invite everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know what state you're calling in from today. Here's how today's call is going to work. I'm going to kick off our conversation with a few questions for our authors, and then we're going to turn to all of you. If you have a question, you can put your question in the chat or the gist of it, and then when I call on you, you will be able to ask your question. Our call today is going to run until 3 p.m. And we're very delighted to be talking with Elliot Ackerman and Admiral Jim Stavridis, the authors of 2034, a novel of the next World War. The book takes us into the near future, where a nuclear war unfolds between the United States and China. It is a gripping and thought-provoking novel that describes how today's political, economic, and technological circumstances could erupt and escalate into the next World War. 2034 became our summer selection when Independent Voting's president, Jackie Salit, who is with us this afternoon, was asked by Peter Ackerman, a friend and co-conspirator in the reform movement, who also is Elliot Ackerman's father, to distribute copies of the book to several hundred activists in the Independent Voting Network. Jackie, an author and a playwright, who is currently at work with a team of authors on a book about the independent voter, which will be released next year, was very eager to have people read the book and explore the issues it raises. So let me introduce our authors. Elliot Ackerman is the author of 5 books and has been nominated for the National Book Award and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He is a frequent contributor to Esquire magazine and the New Yorker, and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He's a former White House Fellow and former Marine, serving 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. Admiral James Trevitas spent more than 35 years in the Navy, rising to the rank of 4-star admiral. He was the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, previously commanded U.S. Southern Command, our military operations throughout Latin America. He has also commanded a Navy destroyer, a destroyer squadron, and an aircraft carrier battle group in combat. He has a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, where he served as dean for 5 years. He's currently vice chair of global affairs of the Carlyle Group and chair of the board of trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation. He is the author of 10 books. 2034 is his first novel. So thank you both for your service and welcome. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks a lot. Wonderful to be with this group.
Be with you.
Great. Let me kick us off with a question for you, Admiral, about the origins of 2034. How did the collaboration with Elliot come about, and why did you decide to tackle the fault lines in US-China foreign policy through a novel?
Yeah, I get the question a lot. You know, you've written 9 books of nonfiction. Why all of a sudden have you decided you're a novelist? Here's the story. I'm an aficionado of Cold War literature. So Soviet, US, the novels, the films, Dr. Strangelove, On the Beach, Red Storm Rising, The Bedford Incident, Failsafe. You've read many of these, seen many of the movies. Always been a fan of that body of literature, and here's why. Because I felt if we could imagine how terrible a war would have been between the US and the Soviet Union, we had a better chance of avoiding it. It kind of acted in a deterrent kind of way. So reflecting on that, Cathy, it occurred to me that there's really no comparative body of literature about how terrible a war between the US and China would be. And unfortunately, I think we are clearly finding our way in at least a Cold War with China, almost a shadow war, much of it currently conducted in the cyber realm. So with that idea, I thought, well, why not write a novel that would reach a lot of people and it would help us imagine how terrible such a war would be, and perhaps that'll act as a deterrent and help us avoid it. So I took that idea to my editor at Penguin Press, and he said roughly the following: you know, Admiral, you're a really great guy, and you're a pretty good writer, but you're not a novelist. And that kind of made me sad. And I went back and wrote a very detailed outline and, bunch of, if you will, application kind of things, took them back to the editor. He looked at all of them and he said, Admiral, you're a great guy and you're a pretty good writer, but you're not a novelist. But my editor said, I know a novelist who might want to work with you. He's a guy named Elliot Ackerman. So I'll let my good friend and colleague, Elliot, pick it up there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jim. So as you mentioned, we share an editor at Penguin Press, a fellow named Scott Moyers. And so Scott, came to me with this idea that the Admiral had. And I don't think he understood that the two of us, had known each other for the better part of a decade and were already friends. When Jim was dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, he invited me to serve as the writer in residence for a semester. And when I asked him, well, what is this going to entail? He sent me an email with a bulletized list of my responsibilities, and one of them was talk with the dean about books when he feels like it. So having that been on my job, having had that on my job description before, we'd had those conversations. I think we understood one another's sensibilities. And so when we started talking about this project, very quickly we realized that, we were aligned in what we wanted this book to be, which was, the book is not a big door stopper. It's not 900 pages. It doesn't have many technological appendices. It's a lean book. And it's focused on a few principal characters, as opposed to, like a Herman Wouk's Winds of War, which has, character legends at the back that you're constantly cross-referencing. You'll be able to stick with these characters very closely. And I thought maybe for folks haven't started the book, I could talk a little bit about some of those characters and take you into the world we created in 2034.
Please do.
Yeah. So when the book opens, it opens on the South China Sea on the bridge of the USS John Paul Jones, which is part of a 3-ship flotilla led by the first principal character you meet, which is Commodore Sarah Hunt. And she is a career naval officer at the end of her career. And this is really going to be her last patrol. And it is a freedom of navigation patrol through the South China Sea, which is a body of water that's half the size of the continental United States. But China today and in the future claims it to be territorial waters, although they are in fact international waters. So we run these freedom of navigation patrols through there to assert their categorization as international waters. So we meet Commodore Sarah Hunt. She's leading one of these freedom of navigation patrols. When off the bridge of her ship, she spies what seems to be a fishing trawler in duress. A smaller vessel and dark smoke is billowing off of its bridge. When she tries to hail it, it proves non-responsive, and she makes the decision to go in closer and try to render aid to this ship. But when she gets closer, she realizes that it in fact is not a run-of-the-mill fishing trawler. There's something much more complex going on that ship. We then cut to the other side of the globe at the same moment, where we meet our second principal character, which is Marine Major Chris Wedge Mitchell. He is a 4th-generation Marine fighter pilot, and his call sign is Wedge because a wedge is the world's oldest and simplest tool, and in many ways, so is he. And when we first meet him, he's piloting his state-of-the-art F-35 Joint Strike Fighter right above the Straits of Hormuz, with basically his starboard wing dancing right along Iranian airspace. And he's sitting in the cockpit lamenting the fact that, he doesn't really feel like much of a fighter pilot, not like his father who flew in Iraq and Afghanistan, his grandfather who flew dropping cluster bombs and napalm in Vietnam, or his great-grandfather who flew in the Second World War. He doesn't feel like much of a fighter pilot because this plane, this F-35, it kind of flies itself. It's so high-tech. And literally at that moment, the plane does begin to fly itself. It diverts into Iranian airspace on a glide slope down to Bandar Abbas airfield. Its controls are non-responsive. We now cut to our third principal character, who is in the White House, and that is Dr. Sandeep Sandy Chowdhury. He is a first-generation American, his family having immigrated from India, and he is working on the national security staff. And he's in the Situation Room, and he's monitoring these two crises as they unfold. The situation going on in the South China Sea and what's occurring above the Straits of Hormuz with Wedge. And he's trying to make sense of these crises. His telephone rings. And on the other line of the phone is our fourth principal character, and that is Admiral Lin Bao, the Chinese military attaché to the United States. And Admiral Lin Bao, who himself has a somewhat complex past. He is of joint American-Chinese parentage. His mother was American, though he was raised in China. And one of the areas where he's made a niche for himself in the Chinese military is being someone who has a very deep understanding of American culture. And the message he has for Sandy Chowdhury is that these two events, what's going on in the South China Sea and what's going on above the Straits of Hormuz, are in fact interrelated, and that China will no longer tolerate having its territorial waters violated by these freedom of navigation patrols. At which point a massive cyber attack is launched on the United States. In effect, the entire eastern seaboard is blinked, the power goes out, and it comes back on. When it comes back on, things aren't exactly as they were before. And so that's basically the kind of the scenario that finishes up the opening pages of the book. I would just be remiss if I didn't mention right at the beginning of the second chapter, you meet the fifth principal character, who, when Wedge's plane is taken out onto the airstrip at Bandar Abbas, waiting for him on the tarmac is Brigadier General Qasim Farshad. He is an officer in the Iranian Quds Force and a veteran of the early 21st century's forever wars, conflicts in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and many others. And when he meets Wedge on the tarmac, he takes him into a holding cell and begins an interrogation of Wedge. So those are the five principal characters of the book, and through their eyes, you're plunged into this world as it is on the brink of a massive war.
One of the things I love about the book, and as you're describing these principal characters who we get to know, is that all sides are humanized. The story's told through regular people. They're not necessarily regular people. They're high actors on this stage, but the fact that you are seeing things through their eyes, I just think was very, very effective in helping us look at a complex picture. One thing I was struck by in the book that I wanted to ask you both about is the president is a woman and an independent. And I wanted to ask you why those choices, and also to comment on a growing trend. And Admiral, you and I were just speaking about this before we started today, the trend towards independence among our veterans. Right now, 45% of returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are identifying as independents. Why do you think that is? And why the choice to have the president be both a woman and an independent?
Maybe I'll jump on the first part of that and Elliot can grab the second part. The choice of a woman was not even really a choice. I think I'd be shocked if we don't have a woman president by 2034. The more carefully thought through choice was to make her an independent. And I had that idea from the very beginning. It aligned with Elliot's views of things. I have two daughters in their late 20s, early 30s, millennials. They look at both political parties and they just shake their heads. And, people act as though somewhere in the Constitution it says, Article XX, there shall be two political parties, one shall be Republican, the other shall be Democrat. As this group knows better than any that I've addressed in 150 appearances for this book, as you know better than anybody, we didn't start out with Republicans and Democrats. We started with Federalists, Whigs, Independents. It was a hodgepodge of political parties. Took us almost 100 years to really firmly solidify the grip that these two parties, in my view, unfortunately have on the political systems. And as a result, it's going to take a while to undo that grip. Efforts like those represented by this group, I think, are extremely important. So making her and independent was a foreshadowing of something I firmly believe will unfold probably by mid-century or so. We're going to find our way to thinking very differently about a political process that I think most on this call would agree is almost irretrievably broken. I'll close by saying, as I said to you, Cathy, I'm a registered independent. I always have been since I was 18 years old. I followed my father, a career military officer, a Marine, by the way, in that tradition. And I see both of my children following in that alignment as well.
Yeah.
Elliot?
Yeah, I think I would just to add to your comment, Cathy, on the observation that an increasing number of military veterans identify as independents. To me, that is not surprising. Politics is culture, and in the military, you're reared in, I would say, a different, if even a subculture of American society, and it's a culture that is very intentionally non-political, in that individuals are welcome to have their politics, and of course do have their politics, as they should, but are taught that politics and partisanship are not first and foremost in the pursuit of the collective good necessarily, and that we suspend those beliefs to work towards a higher purpose. So I think after, whether it's 4 years or 40 years of inhabiting that culture, it then becomes very intuitive to take that way of being, that way of citizenship, and have it extend to you in civilian life. So to me, it's no surprise that you see a high correlation between independents and veterans existing.
Thank you both. Yeah. Let me throw you a big question here. What do you hope that readers will take away from 2034?
Well, we're probably both going to want to bite on that one, but my hope is that people will say, this is a cautionary tale. This is what we don't want to happen. And then they will begin to think more seriously about, how do we avoid it? How do we reverse engineer ourselves back from the calamitous year we describe in 2034 and avoid sleepwalking, stumbling into a war with China? I mentioned earlier my sense of Cold War literature, US, Soviet. The other echo you ought to get in this book is 1914, The Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman's magisterial treatment of how Europe, which had all these intertwined economies, royal families related by blood and marriage, yet they managed to stumble into an apocalyptic war that killed 20 million people. And by the way, in 1914, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Hohenzollern Empire, the Kaiser's Germany. By 1918, all gone. The world really spins on this axis. So we don't want this. So how do we avoid it? And we don't have time to unpackage all that, but I'll simply say we need a strategy. We need a strategy for interacting and dealing with China that is not premised on military dominance, because that's not going to work, nor is it premised on economic imperialism. That's not going to work. It's not going to be strictly premised on waving our hands and saying, we're just better because we're Democrats and libertarians and we have freedom in our society. That's not going to work. We need a clever, nuanced strategy to face up to China. If we don't, I fear we're going to stumble right in the direction of 2034.
I would only add that as a novelist, I hope you walk away caring about these 5 characters and you feel like you spent a bunch of time with them and you know them. And the story ends differently for each of them, some better, some worse. So I hope you remember what happens to them, and a reader will remember that the lessons some of them have learned in this journey they take in the year 2034. And then I would only add to that, as a reader, you're taking that journey with them. And this kind of goes to your comment before, Cathy, about veterans and political independence. Something that's really struck me many years ago was when I first went to war, when I went to Iraq, and I remember we flew over there. I was led a platoon of about 45 Marines. And I mean, first of all, there were a handful of Marines who had never been on an airplane before. So their first airplane ride in my platoon was to go to Iraq. But there were many more, obviously, who'd never left the country before. And so if you've never left the country before and your first experience with foreign country is a war in Iraq, I think for many veterans, it's a jarring experience. But in some ways, something good that comes out of that is it's a very stark reminder that the nice life we enjoy in America, despite our dysfunction, needs to be earned. And 2034 is creating an alternate reality that's very frightening, but there are many realities of how countries behave and perform that are right outside of our borders if we allow ourselves to get too dysfunctional. And so again, for veterans, I think we often understand this intuitively because we've had these very formative experiences of going and trying to do something good in those countries, even when it doesn't work out perfectly. And so I think, if you're going to read the book 2034, whether you've traveled all over the world or you've never left the United States before, I hope it gives you a glimpse into an alternate reality that we should be doing everything we can to avoid and is avoidable.
Thank you both very much. Yeah. We're going to take some questions from all of our Politics for the People Book Club participants today. Here's a reminder, if you have a question, pop the gist of the question into the chat. And I can see that we have a lot of questions. We'll take as many as we can. And let me go to Denny Flaherty from Arizona to ask our first question. Denny, you're going to have to unmute yourself and then we'll be able to hear you and you can ask your question.
Hi, gentlemen, it's my honor as an Air Force retiree to be able to participate in this discussion. My question is, what should our response be when so-called ransomware attacks are suspected of being the camel's nose probing our cyber defenses?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Dennis. And a couple of points to be made here. First of all, there's a national level response to not just ransomware, but these probes that are coming at us. And therefore, the National Security Agency, U.S. Cyber Command, and other government entities have a very strong responsibility to do everything they can to attribute these attacks. Secondly, when they can be successfully attributed, we need to begin by publicizing where they're coming from. So most recently, we've seen a spate of these coming from Russia, typically from criminal gangs that are operating with, at a minimum, the acquiescence of the Putin government, probably with their encouragement. So we need to identify them. Number three, we need to respond nationally. And so if you have followed this issue, it sounds like you do, you'll recall that a number of these firms, if you will, have seen their cryptocurrency disappear. They've actually vanished online. I assure you that is not a coincidence. Without getting into classification, I'll simply say the US government has the ability to respond. The trickier part of this, Dennis, and your question implies it correctly, is whether or not we then ought to have a kind of reckoning with the government. Let's stay with Russia as an example, although you can point to other countries. Do we go after the Putin government in very aggressive ways? I think the answer to that is not quite yet. We ought to continue the tactical responses that we've been using directed at these entities, continue to have an ongoing process of saying to Russia, in this case, you cannot continue to do this. And we have tools at the far end that can be directed at the Russian government, senior level Russians. A lot of bad things can happen to overseas bank accounts of senior officials, for example. So those are cards that are yet to be played. Right now, we're going after the entities that are actually conducting this, I think, relatively effectively. I'll close on this by saying private companies have a responsibility here as well to protect themselves, to ensure they're using good cyber hygiene, to take advantage of firms that can provide tools to the individual companies, because the threat surface is so vast here that the US government isn't going to be able to prevent every attack. That's got to be private-public cooperation. Both sides have to work together on that. Great question. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to, did you want to add anything, Elliot, before I take up? Okay, so let's go to Bob Pearls from New Mexico. Bob, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, it's great to be here, Cathy. Nice to see you. I enjoyed 2034 so much. I want to thank Jackie for sending it out and for Elliot and Jim for writing it. Really quite entertaining. As a former US diplomat, I agree that we've seen the State Department's influence reduced over the years. I'd love to hear the two authors' thoughts about whether you think the balance between defense and Department of State needs to be better aligned, more in balance in the future to avoid a 2034 scenario, or do you think it's much more complex than that? You know, what are your takes about the influence of state versus the Pentagon? Love to hear what you're thinking.
Sure.
I can sort of
Go
start.
ahead, Elliot.
Yeah, I can start tactically, and then I'll let the admiral kind of go strategic. I would say, you know, in my experience, representing and serving in the U.S. military overseas, you know, very often on the ground in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, young on the ground troops were being asked to shoulder civic responsibilities at the local level that, you know, typically one would imagine would be handled by civilian agencies. And in many regards, you know, you would see infantrymen or special operations doing an admirable job, you know, starting a waterworks program or managing a road construction program, but these are not necessarily the things that they signed up in the missions they signed up to perform. So there was a lot of sort of ad hoc work going on. Now the question then begins, you know, do we need to, you know, make our State Department more robust and give it kind of more granular tactical development capabilities? And I think there certainly is room for that. And I think there is definitely a downside in having the first and most forward-facing portion of U.S. engagement in many places be our military. I think anywhere we can have the face of America not necessarily be our military is probably a good thing because it is a less intimidating face. But
Could not agree more. And, you know, don't take my word for it. Let me quote Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, former director of the CIA, one of my life mentors. Bob Gates was fond of pointing out that we have more people in military bands than we do foreign service officers. You know, what's wrong with that picture? In my view, quite a bit. Or my friend and contemporary General, later Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, who often said, look, you can spend the money on, if you don't spend the money on diplomacy and development, you're going to end up buying me more ammunition. And so here I like to use the analogy that we're all kind of familiar with, which is medicine, between soft power and hard power. So hard power, the use of the military instrument, is like at the end game in medicine. It's when you have let things go or you've been struck by a terrible disease and you have to undergo a difficult operation. The road to recovery is long. The chances of success are uneven. You really don't want to be in that world, right? Over here, soft power, which is diplomacy and development, this is, medically speaking, this is preventative care. This is taking a baby aspirin every day. This is taking a walk every day. This is eating reasonably well, reducing your alcohol, not smoking, finding meditation. It doesn't cost very much. It's not very painful to do it. It's actually quite enjoyable. And it is so effective, so cost effective. So the point here, Bob, is yes, I would say take some resources, and Gates and Mattis would back me up on this, take it out of the hard power side of the equation and get it over here on the very soft power, highly cost-effective side of the equation. And as you deeply appreciate, it's not just diplomacy, it's development, two different things. USAID does one, State Department does the other. But boy, is that a cost-effective use of taxpayer dollars, because that's where you play the long game. Let me close by saying, I don't want to imply that you don't need hard power. We're not going to negotiate a solution with the Islamic State. And unfortunately, it looks like we're not going to negotiate an ending with the Taliban and many other extremist groups. You're going to need hard power at times. But that long game combines them both, hard power and soft power. Together, that's smart power, as some have called it. I'm a strong proponent of finding that balance. We don't have it right at the moment. Yes, I would shift resources toward diplomacy and development.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. We're now going to go to Tiani Coleman from New Hampshire. Tiani, you have to unmute and we'll be able to hear your question.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated being able to read your book. Like Cathy indicated earlier, I really did get into the characters and appreciated how you did humanize them and give them all a story and help us see how tragic war is because of all of the different human lives all around the world who are affected, and to how important it is for us to be able to see broad perspectives and understand people and cultures. My question is related to this idea that I, as an individual who's not involved in national security, all I can really think of that I can do and that we can do is to try to be better peacemakers in our own lives, try to be able to try to be the kind of people who always want to bring about a peaceful solution in our own lives, to try to create a culture of peace. But as your book suggests, things can turn south very quickly, and we don't have time to slowly create a better culture of peace. We have to know what we can do immediately. So I'm wondering, what can be done immediately to try to avert this type of disaster? And in asking that question, I'd just like to point out Sarah Hunt, for example. She was actually, portrayed as a very likable character of high integrity, in my view, although she was also at the center of this and, made decisions that apparently caused a lot of this, some of them without her really even realizing what she was doing. But besides her being unwilling to allow her crew to launch a nuclear strike, what else would you have someone like her do differently?
I'll go ahead and start on that. First of all, I resonate to your point that there's a long game being played here of developing a culture that's smart enough to avoid war, and that's important both here in the United States, in China, in Russia, all around the world. And obviously, we're still falling into wars and there are conflicts all around. But compared to the 20th century, the 21st century is unfolding in my view, in a somewhat better way than it did 100 years ago, when the world literally found itself sleepwalking into a war. So yes, there's a cultural component to this. I would say, and again, this audience, I think, gets this, the immediate thing you can be doing is voting for candidates who make sense to you, who are, in your view, effective, willing to reach across the aisles and work together, have some sense of the international world, are good leaders, are individuals of integrity. I think the ballot box is a very strong place that all of us can register a desire for the kind of leadership that we want and need in the country. In terms of Sarah Hunt, yeah, she makes several crucial mistakes in the beginning of the book and later on. And so does Sandy Chowdhury, the National Security Advisor in Washington, D.C. And the reason is because they're human, and humans make mistakes, and mistakes lead to miscalculations from the other side. And you can drop a plumb line from many conflicts in history to single acts of miscalculation, going back to the ancient Greeks, and as recently as 100 years ago, World War I began with an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo in a dusty corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Underlying factors, absolutely, but that spark, that miscalculation, that human mistake, can we avoid those? I think we can help avoid those by how we train in this military context that we're discussing, how we train our military, how we train our diplomats, how we train Americans who go abroad in the service of the nation. Their training, their experiences have to include mechanisms that help them avoid the mistakes that Sarah Hunt tragically makes, particularly in the opening pages of the novel. Elliot?
I would only add that, this is a book that covers a lot of ground geopolitically, from the South China Sea to the Straits of Hormuz to northern waters in Russia, and when we get into to 10G subsurface fiber optic cables, we try to go everywhere with this book and lay out many national security threats and how they're dealt with in the future. And I would say with all of that, one of the very strong subtexts in the book is that the greatest national security threat that faces the United States in these pages is our own internal dysfunction and inability to act and meet these threats appropriately as they arise. And so, again, what can people on this call do, if they feel as though they might not necessarily be able to help arbitrate disputes in the South China Sea? Well, it's, citizens in this country not only supporting candidates, but, also kind of getting into the weeds and doing some of the reform work that I know people on this call are interested in. That's very important. Our democracy only stays healthy if people in future generations are continually committed to tending that garden and keeping it healthy. So that, I hope, is a message that conveys in the book as well.
Thank you both. And great question, Tiani. Let's go to Carl Farmer from Rhode Island. Carl, you can unmute yourself to ask your question.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Basically, two things happened to me this summer. I was finishing up reading Thucydides and Herodotus, who are meant to be the beginning of history or the beginning of historical recounting, I guess. And it seems that in that war, which was the Peloponnesian and Persian war between Greece and Persia, basically one good guy beats up the other good guy and then eventually becomes very powerful, but then they fail later from rotting from within, which is, I think, a point of your book and so forth. I wish I knew exactly how we could make this better, other than all the things that we are believing in, like independent voting and things like that. The other thing is my granddaughter's reading 1984 this summer for a summer read, and it's 50 years on for your book. So two questions: how do we keep ourselves so that we don't fall into that age-old trap? And the other thing is, was this a bit of an homage to Orwell?
Okay, I got dibs on the second question. Yes, it was an homage to George Orwell. Elliot, you got the first part.
I would only add with the date, when we began working on this book, in early drafts, because the earliest drafts were all timestamped as they are in the book. We began with that. But the date was in 2034, and the more drafts we did, actually, I think we began somewhere in the 2050s. And the more we kind of played out the scenarios, the date kind of kept coming closer and closer. It's kind of like a tide going up on the beach, until finally we were in the 2030s. And it seemed to make sense. Well, what year in the 2030s will we pick? Well, let's pick 2034. There are nice echoes, nice sort of apocalyptic echoes there from 1984. And that seemed appropriate. I would also say that since the book's come out, we've gotten some very nice comments about it, which we appreciate. But there has been one criticism, which I think is a very apt one, which is a number of China watchers have said, guys, we love the book, but the thing you really got wrong is, in fact, the date. this is much sooner than 2034. So food for thought there. With regards to the reading of Thucydides, I've always considered myself a great enthusiast of history. And I think that one of the interesting things that comes with studying, thinking, and writing about war is, as much as things change, nothing changes. And it's this age-old human enterprise that we do generation to generation. So if you want to understand humanity in some ways, you can understand us through the ways we keep engaging this enterprise successively over the millennia. And when it comes to Thucydides, there's obviously this idea of the Thucydides Trap, which many of you may be familiar with, which is this pattern of what occurs when a rising power challenges an established power. And in the case of the Peloponnesian War, the rising power was Sparta, and it challenged the established power Athens, defeating Athens. More recent example of that is the Second World War, where an established power, Great Britain, is challenged by a rising power, Germany, really in the First and Second World Wars. And so there's that conflict. Who's going to win, the rising power or the established power? And so when you come into 2034, that is sort of the construct we've put into the book. Established power of the United States is challenged by a rising power, China. Who is going to win? And I know many of you have read the book, and for maybe the few of you who have not read the book, I would just entice you to read it further, because I will tell you that neither of them wins, China nor the United States. You see, there's a third party who is really the beneficiary of this conflict. And I think that is in many ways inspired by our own history as Americans. Because if we look at the last 100 years, I would certainly categorize them as an American century. And it was an American century forged out of a European conflict that fit that model of the Thucydides trap. And the beneficiary of that conflict was the United States, I think, leaving us with a lesson that comes up in the book, which is oftentimes it's not very good to be the one who starts a war, but you always want to be the one who finishes the war. Just like the United States finished the war, finished the Second World War, and was able to enjoy the spoils. So it is neither China nor the United States that really finishes this war to its benefit.
Admiral, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think that covers it nicely between the two of us.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go to Jackie Salit now from New York.
Hello there. Admiral and Elliot, thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate your taking the time. And there's been such an enthusiastic response to the book from our networks. And it's just been a pleasure to be able to make it available to people. Here's my question. The issue of US-China relations, it seems to me it's becoming more and more of a political football in the country. And I wonder if you could both speak to what it is you think that the American people most misunderstand about China.
I think the American people underestimate China. I think they have this sense that China, for the last several hundred years, has really not been a significant international actor. And in fact, going back 100 years ago, China was a very weak nation, even though it's always been quite populous. And I think kind of burned into American psychological DNA is this sense of China as, well, let's not worry about them too much. And that would be a mistake for any number of reasons that are becoming increasingly obvious. Their economy is strong and will probably overtake ours by mid-decade. They have a rising military, including 360 capital warships. We only have 300. Ours are better. Our capabilities are more, but they're rising rapidly militarily. They're consolidating diplomatic engagements all around the world, including strong alliances with Russia and Iran, which we foreshadow in the book. And they are technologically moving very quickly after the holy grail of the early 21st century technologically, which is artificial intelligence. We don't have time to kind of unpackage each of those things, but I think Americans tend to underestimate, not be aware of those collective things, and kind of have a feeling that what's the big deal with China? Watch out. And I don't say that in the sense of I'm worried that China's going to overtake us and zoom by us on the world stage. I don't see that happening. But I think if we consistently underestimate China, they will, over time, become a much more capable actor who can shape the international environment in ways that are not to our advantage. New forms of currency, new trade alignments, their Belt and Road strategy economically, artificial intelligence that dominates global data. These will not end well for the United States if we can't compete with China. So my concern is that we underestimate China. That's part of the storyline here in 2034.
Yeah. I would only add, agreeing with everything the Admiral said, that on the flip side of that coin, I think there is a strain in American culture right now too that is also quick to look at China, particularly with regards to the coronavirus and our two nations' respective responses, as being sort of 20 feet tall. China is not 20 feet tall. And, if we look at COVID as an example, the coronavirus is something that came out of China and in many ways is the product of a closed insular system. In so much as if, there were certain methods of transparency, we might not have seen the spread when it first established itself in Wuhan. Additionally, when we look at vaccines, the most effective vaccines have come out of the United States, the West, the free world, showing the superiority of our system there. The conflict we have in China, and so much of its sort of broader framing, is again this sort of question of what are the most effective means of government and the most effective means of unlocking collective human potential. Is it through directing it in an authoritarian way, or is it through creating a system that allows individuals to flourish and focuses on the individuals? And we've been here before. This is not the first time in our history of the United States, or in the history of the free world, that we've seen this conflict between totalitarianism and small L liberalism. And it seems as though, we're entering into that type of a conflict, not necessarily a military conflict, but a real conflict of thinking and conflict of ideas again. And I think once again, the United States will be on the vanguard of trying to prove that a liberal world order is the one we should all be embracing.
Yeah, let me add a thought there, which is this idea of, can our ideas compete? Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute them imperfectly. They're the right values. Can they compete on the international stage? And, people sometimes say to me, Admiral, you're right, it's a war of ideas. No, it's a marketplace of ideas. We got to compete. We got to recognize that China is very capably creating a narrative that says a much better system for your country is a streamlined system of governance with the power of capitalism harnessed to it. Look at how America is falling apart because Republicans and Democrats can't get together and solve problems. Look how the Capitol was stormed. You don't see that in Beijing. It's a very streamlined system of governance. That's the narrative they're putting out. We better have the counter narrative. We better get out in the social networks. We've got to construct the arguments to compete, because it is not self-evident around the world that we're the right answer anymore.
Thank you both, and thanks for that question, Jackie. Let's go to Reed Flory. Reed, if you unmute yourself, we'll be able to hear your question.
Well, I had two of them, but let me take the one that, what optimally should our future military look like?
We should invest more in cyber, both defensive and offensive. We should invest more in hypersonic cruise missiles. That sounds very high tech, but it just means weapon systems that move at multiples of the speed of sound, say 5 to 7 times the speed of sound. Most today go 2 to 3 times, so faster. We should invest more in unmanned vehicles from space to the bottom of the ocean, because unmanned vehicles are not tethered to human endurance and can stay, as the saying goes, the unblinking eye over the battlefield. I would argue, the Admiral's going to say this, we need more maritime platforms because that's where these conflicts going forward, I think, are going to be centered. And I would argue we need more special operations, more elite human teams to operate all of those systems. People like Marine Raiders, like Elliot Ackerman was, our Navy SEALs, our Army Green Berets, our Air Force PJs. So I would say that's where the rheostat ought to be turned more toward those kind of systems. I say a rheostat very deliberately. A rheostat's that thing on your dining room wall that turns the lights up or down. You need to turn the dial up, but it's not an on and off switch. You're not going to just get rid of all the aircraft carriers, get rid of every tank, get rid of third generation fighter pilots. You're going to still need some of those systems, but we ought to be spending more on the systems that I outlined a moment ago. Elliot?
No, I would agree with all of that. I think one of the interesting conundrums the U.S. military is in is at the same time that we are a really deeply experienced military based off of the 20 years of war since 9/11. This is a moment when the U.S. military is pivoting heavily towards China, which is a very different type of conflict than the ones that we've had experience fighting. And so that's occurring in real time right now, and it's very interesting to watch.
Can I add one thought there? And I'm actually going to throw it to Elliot, but we need to be careful that we do not become so enamored of these new technologies that we are not overtaken by something else that comes along. And Elliot has a terrific way of describing that goes back 700 years. Elliot?
We talked a little bit about history. And one of the themes in the book I hope comes across is it's not just enough to have the latest and best technology, you've got to have the right technology. And so historically, an anecdote I've always loved is if you go back to the early 15th century, the year 1415, there was a battle fought in Agincourt. Some of you might be familiar with that. There was a play by a little known playwright named Shakespeare called Henry V that deals with the Battle of Agincourt. And if you know anything about that history, what occurred was the British had invaded France. They were way at the end of their supply lines, tired, trying to get a home, really strung out, and they met the cream of the French army on this battlefield. And the French knights, their aristocracy, stepped out onto the field that morning after it rained pretty heavily the night before. And what at the time was the most state-of-the-art technology for a medieval army, which was plate armor. They'd managed to at great expense fold the steel, so it was really, really tough. So they're wearing this heavy plate armor, convinced they're going to just destroy this upstart English army that did not have the same technology and was outnumbered. And so confident were they that they decided they were just going to march across this muddy field and dispatch all these English soldiers. Well, the British had brought, or the English had brought a different technology to the battlefield, lower costs, lower tech. It was the longbow. And they rained arrows down on these French knights who were struggling to get across this muddy field and completely routed them. I mean, it was one of the most one-sided victories ever, and really set conditions for what would become, much of the modern European nation states. So that is in a case where, yes, the French had the most expensive, most sort of exciting technology of the day, but it was the wrong technology for that battle. And we, the United States, need to be very careful as we invest in our legacy platforms like our state-of-the-art aircraft carriers and platforms like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which you see in the book, that we're not investing in the wrong technology. And I would just say in the world we build in 2034, it is no accident that the first fighter plane you see is this state-of-the-art F-35, but the last one you see in sort of the final existential battle of the book is a old Generation 1 F-18 Hornet built circa 1990.
Thank you. We have just 2 minutes left, so we're going to do a rapid fire round, and we'll take our next question from Harry Kresge in New York. Harry, you have to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Okay, I'll be brief. it's not every day that an admiral writes a book about history, the future, politics. What kind of pushback, if any, have you gotten, Admiral?
Yeah, I've gotten positive feedback from a wide variety of folks. I asked my team to look for other admirals who've written novels, and there are a handful. Most of them are historical fiction. I think I'm the first admiral to write a book about future fiction, so we'll put that one in the record book, at least so far. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are, thank you, Harry. We are out of time. Obviously, we could go on for another hour at least. I want to express our thanks to both of you for being here today for such a rich conversation. And I hope that you'll continue to collaborate. I feel like there are sequels.
Actually,
but we really,
funny you should mention that. We have signed a 2-book sequel, 2054 and 2074, which will follow the surviving characters and the storylines deep into the 21st century. So stay tuned. We'll do it again in a couple of years.
how fantastic. All right. Well, we will really look forward to having you back and reading
Thank
those
you.
too. I am going to just end with a couple of announcements. I'm going to announce our next Politics for the People book club selection early in September. If you have a recommendation for the book club, please email me at cathy.stewart5@gmail.com. Tell me the book and why you think it would be a good selection for the book club. Also, Independent Voting and The People both have regular newsletters to keep you up to date and abreast of developments in the independent movement and the nonpartisan citizen movement for reform. You can visit our websites, independentvoting.org and thepeople.org, and sign up today. On Monday night, August 16th, the People are hosting a very exciting citizens engagement forum on redistricting with Katie Fahey, who led the successful 2018 Voters Not Politician campaign in Michigan that created a genuine nonpartisan citizens redistricting commission. If you'd like to go, we're going to pop the link in the chat so you can register for the event, and a very rich conversation. Finally, mark your calendars for Monday, October 25th, when Independent will be hosting a very important virtual event, the 20th Anniversary Anti-Corruption Awards. Stay tuned for more details. Thanks so much for being with us today. Have a great rest of your summer and make sure to read a couple of books. Talk to everyone soon.